a little bit to the United States, because you currently have a visitor over there now, President Zelensky, who has gone to the United States to present what he refers to as the victory plan. Now, there's some lack of clarity about what this plan entails. It seems to be for the United States to start doing long-range precision strikes into Russia, which Putin has warned would amount to a direct war between the US and Russia, which, yeah, best case scenario might be World War III without nuclear weapons, but of course it could be much worse. So not only these strikes into Russia, but also NATO membership, apparently. So it's a bit unclear what the victory package entails. The main argument is that this is necessary to pressure Russia to sit down and talk, which is also a bit dishonest, it seems, because it was the US and UK that sabotaged the Istanbul Agreement in early 2022, and also Zelensky passed a law banning negotiations with Russia. So it's unclear why suddenly it's presented as Russian obstruction being the main problem, given that none of the Western countries have wanted to even have diplomacy with the Russians for the past 2.5 years. So it seems unclear what this is supposed to achieve. But given the high stakes, what do you think this victory plan entail? And do you think Washington will give him what he wants?
It sounds much more like a sustainment plan, how to keep the war going for a few more months as opposed to victory. Because we've had other victory plans submitted in the past. If you go back a year or so, you had this plan for victory. If you can replace all of our losses, and we'll have another major offensive, but we need to build a new army. You recall this back in 22, 23, 24. We've been down this road before. I don't think this is a victory plan. I think it's just a sustainment plan. How do we keep things going? I think that the people in the White House are not enthusiastic about sanctioning long-range precision strikes against targets in Russia. I think they understand the consequences. And I think they're actually looking for a way to quietly retreat from that position. So I think there's a willingness to provide many more things, including artillery ammunition, replenish vehicles. I understand there's an order for 200 Bradleys now to ship to Ukraine, but I'm very skeptical that they will allow these long-range precision strikes. And I think that's a good thing, frankly, because I don't think we really want to go to war with Russia, despite our foolish statements and policy positions. Now, that doesn't mean it still couldn't happen. I mean, I've been wrong before, but I think this is not likely to be the case. I think there's something else going on, though, that's far more important, and that is that the Europeans themselves want to step back from this. So support for this policy is eroding rapidly. It's very clear that the Germans want nothing more to do with this, despite what Mrs. Baerbock may say or other members of the Scholz government. He's on very shaky ground. The Russians know this, and I think they would welcome change in the Berlin government, which is probably inevitable at this point. I just don't know how soon. There may be changes in Paris as well, and changes in other European governments on the model of, say, Slovakia and Hungary. Things are not well in Poland. The Polish population is not at all enthusiastic about being drawn into a war. And more recently, you had this attack up near Tver in northwest Russia. And it's interesting, if you look at the locations that we struck, or when I say we, I'm talking about the Ukrainians, and we don't know where they were launched from. I've heard different theories, something about Latvia having been a base for the launch of these unmanned combat aerial vehicles against this ammunition storage area. But if you look at the radar coverage, our data undoubtedly was provided to the Ukrainians, showing them that they had a good chance of getting in there and inflicting damage without necessarily electrifying or signaling the entire air and missile defense network. Now, how much damage should they do? I don't think it's nearly on the scale that the Ukrainians had hoped for. And it certainly has not set back Russian munition production They undoubtedly found some Iskander missiles that could be detonated, and that helped to explain the giant fireballs and explosions, along with lots of artillery ammunition. I'm told some of it came from North Korea. Who knows? But the bottom line is it was a flash in the pan, not a game changer by any means. It's not going to slow the Russians down or inhibit what's happening down in Ukraine. And we know that in Ukraine itself, the front continues to crumble, and the regime in Kiev is on the verge of collapse. There's no question about that. And I think the Russians know it, and they're proceeding cautiously as they have thus far, because they too don't want a war with NATO or the United States. So I think if there's any good news in all of this, I think it is that both sides, Washington and Moscow, really don't want to go to war with each other in eastern Ukraine. And the question is, how do you get past the current impasse? In other words, how do you move beyond where we are now? And there are undoubtedly debates in Moscow about do we destroy several city blocks in Kiev and then move forces over the river and into Kiev itself? I don't know. Again, I think Mr. Putin has never wanted that. He does not want to govern Western Ukraine. He would like Western Ukraine, if it's going to retain its independence, to be Austrian-like. And I think there are people ready to accept that in Europe. The sticking point, of course, is London and Washington. There's no willingness at this point to compromise. However, I suspect that Moscow anticipates that might change after the election, regardless of whomever is elected. So I think the real bad news, the real danger point is in the Middle East now, much less the case in Ukraine. And I think there's a healthy respect for the hypersonic missile arsenal that the Russians have and the enormous damage they can inflict. You know, you're talking about missiles flying somewhere between 4,500 miles an hour to 6,000 or 7,000 miles per hour, carrying enormous warheads, 1,500, 1,700, 2,000 pounds. And of course, when you move at that speed, the impact of the warhead is that much greater than it otherwise would be. So you're seeing detonations that look to the human eye as being essentially nuclear, but they're not. No nuclear weapons have been used, and I don't think any will be used in Europe. On the other hand, the Israelis have nuclear weapons. And I don't think we can rule out the potential use of those weapons depending on the circumstances. So that's again, you have two very different situations. And I think the Middle Eastern one is far more dangerous to us right now than what's happening in Eastern Ukraine. That does not mean that it could not change quickly if someone does something exceedingly stupid. And one of the things that people do worry about, I think, in Washington as well as Moscow, is the sort of outside possibility that some stupid thing is done by the Ukrainians over and above and in spite of any guidance or wishes we may express. But barring that, I think the war in Ukraine has a good chance of coming to an end by the end of the year, simply because of all the events that I mentioned, changes in Europe, changes in Ukraine,